Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on the Night Spinner. In this video, I'm going to start with a general overview of what the Night Spinner is, how it functions on the table for those of you who maybe are newer to Craft Worlds, and then I'm going to discuss the 2 or 3 builds in which I think the Night Spinner is most effective, how to think about deployment and tactics during the game, and then as I'm getting to the end of that section, I will transition into talking about why the Night Spinner might be preferable to units like the support platform with the Shadow Weaver, which is also an indirect fire weapon, and the Dark Reaper Tempest Launcher, which is also an indirect fire weapon. Those are I think those are the units that most obviously would jockey with your Night Spinners for an indirect fire role in your list, and so I think those units are excellent, by the way, but since this is the unit focus video on the Night Spinner, I will present some reasons for preferring the Night Spinner over those other units, at least in some lists. But before we start, I do want to say a quick thank you and big shout out to my very first Patreons. I went live with my Patreon earlier this week, and I think I have about 15 enthusiastic aspect warriors who've already signed on, and that's great. I really, really appreciate it. I feel hugely buoyed by your enthusiasm and your willingness to invest in supporting the channel. Thank you. And those patrons, by the way, will have had early access to this video. If there's anybody else out there who is consuming craftworld.com content and is interested in supporting the channel and getting early access to some content, please consider signing up for the Patreon. I will link it in the video description. Okay. Oh, last disclaimer. No more unit focus videos on codex units after this one until we get our new codex, at which point, obviously, I will redo everything. But any other unit focus videos I do between now and then will be Forge World units, which are less likely to change, of course, when the new codex comes out. Okay, here we go. So the Night Spinner it's a tank, and it is the standard Craft Worlds chassis with toughness 7, 12 wounds, a 16-inch move. What distinguishes it from units like the Falcon or the Fire Prism is its signature weapon, right? The Doom Weaver, which each Night Spinner is equipped with a single Doom Weaver, which has a 48-inch range. That's for the purposes of a 9th edition board, for all intents and purposes, the whole table. It fires heavy 2d6 shots, but it's a blast weapon, so when you're targeting a unit with more than 10 models in it, it's 12 shots, which is fabulous. Strength 7, 2 damage, no AP, but on rolls, wound rolls of 6 or better, like with the shuriken weapons, this has AP -4 instead of AP 0. And there's a way to capitalize on that when dealing with certain kinds of targets, and we'll talk about that later in the video. So that's the Night Spinner. It's a heavy support option that is, I guess, as I said earlier in the video, it's an indirect fire option, so it's competing with units like the Tempest Launcher and the Shadow Weaver, but also you only have so many heavy support slots in your list, so it's reasonable to suppose that it's competing with every heavy support unit, from Warwalkers to Warwalkers. Warwalkers are so good. Obviously, Fire Prisms, everything. So I think it's probably obvious, right, to everybody who's listening to this already, that the primary role for the Night Spinner, the most obvious role for the Night Spinner, is Infantry Elimination. And what's cool about it is that it has a profile that's very effective against light infantry, and can be quite effective with that flat 2 damage against heavy infantry with a damage character, or a wounds characteristic of 2. Now, it is true that heavy infantry have usually, anything with 2 wounds usually has a 3-up armor save. Not necessarily, but frequently. If it's a bike or something like an AdMech horse dog, it might just have a 4-up. But in any event, that lack of AP may initially seem like a real barrier to eliminating heavy infantry. It turns out that it really isn't. What this tank wants to do is sit completely out of line of sight in your backfield, buffed in very particular ways, while it puts the hurt on either fragile enemy target elimination units that are out of sight, like a unit of Space Marine Eradicators that's trying to stay, hidden, or to eliminate maybe objective holders who are hiding, in your opponent's deployment zone, completely out of line of sight. It's a way to prevent your opponent from scoring. Those are the sort of obvious roles for the Night Spinner, and they're great roles. Even if it only did that, it would be very sensible to consider including one of these in your list. But I think it's even better than it initially appears. In terms of initial appearance, actually, I'm gonna go ahead and admit that it's understandable if it initially appeared bad to you. Back in 8th edition, when the Codex first came out, and I looked at the profile for the Night Spinner, I was not one of. There were people who immediately realized that even without the blast roll, this could be very good. I was not one of these people. I looked at that 0 AP and I thought, no way. Anything that I would want to target with this, would be easier to eliminate with something else. And I was wrong. And in 9th edition, with that blast rule, it's even better because suddenly the indirect fire profile is super valuable. So let's start with how this, I think, best fits into a list. To begin with, I think if it's worth, most units, there are exceptions to this, but most units, if it's worth taking one, you probably should have two. And I'm going to start by saying, if you're considering including a Night Spinner in your list, you probably should consider including 2 Night Spinners in your list. This is just a good principle of list building in general, because if you've put a unit into your list, it's there to do a particular job. And if you have allocated points to a unit doing a particular job, then it's an important job to do. And if it's an important job to do, that means that you need to have reasonable confidence that it will perform it. And 2 units doing that task is generally more reliable and better than 1 unit doing that task. There are exceptions to this. I think, for example, Shadow Specters are a wonderful example of a unit where your one and done is good. I know somebody's already typing an angry comment they haven't even seen. I'm sure there are lists out there that are running multiple units of Shadow Specters effectively, but I think in general, barring some sort of boutique angle, if you include Shadow Specters in your list, you probably don't need more than 1 unit of them. You might have a single unit of Rangers helping you score objectives, but generally, right, most of the time, anything that's not an HQ unit, if it's worth having 1, it's worth having 2. That's especially true of Night Spinners, because a list with a Night Spinner in it, or 2 Night Spinners in it, is built with indirect fire in mind, and then you need enough of that indirect fire in order for it to make sense to buff that indirect fire in the ways that you need to buff it in order for it to be effective. So the basic principle I think the driving force behind any sort of Craftworld's target elimination unit is rerolls. You need to be able to, your target elimination units need to be able to reroll lots of dice. That's why Expert Crafters is so popular, is because it's an easy way to run MSU units and give Craftworlds those rerolls that they really depend on to be able to hold their head up even in semi-competitive play. So if you're going to have 1 Night Spinner, you probably need 2, and you need to be able to reroll a lot of those 4d6 dice that your 2 Night Spinners will present you with. So here's what I suggest. I suggest putting 2 Night Spinners into a patrol detachment. It could be some other kind of detachment, but a patrol detachment with the custom Craftworld traits Expert Crafters and Masterful Shots. And what this does, so Expert Crafters, in case you've been living under a Wraithbone ruin or something and you don't know, lets the unit reroll 1 die to hit if you're in America, 1 dice if you're in Britain, and 1 die or dice to wound in each phase, which is pretty powerful. Now, that's not initially that's not an obvious pick for the Night Spinner, because the Night Spinner is relying on volume of fire. Usually the 1 reroll in the hit phase and the 1 reroll in the wound phase, that's more effective for things like Bright Lances and Star Cannons. But when I get to the end of this build, it'll make sense why Expert Crafters works well here. And then Masterful Shots allows a unit to ignore cover bonuses for the units that it's targeting. And this is pretty important for the Night Spinner. It's not absolutely essential. Can you run Night Spinners effectively with other? Yes. But the real advantage to Masterful Shots is without AP, Night Spinners can have a tough time with units units in cover, right? Space Marines suddenly have a 2-up save. even sort of light infantry can go from a 4 up to a 3 up, and that can be a bit of an issue. And so being able to ignore cover helps mitigate what is probably the Night Spinner's greatest handicap. You also, I think, if you're running Night Spinners, I think unless you're in a very particular kind of build, an alternative build, which I'll talk about in a moment, you need an autark. So 2 Night Spinners and an autark. That's, I think, the basic build. The autark allows nearby units to reroll ones to hit. And so the cocktail is this. You have 2 Night Spinners in your deployment zone, completely out of line of sight. There's an autark nearby, allowing them to reroll ones. And then because you have expert crafters, they're rerolling, each of those tanks is rerolling all of its ones and one of its twos to hit. So suddenly their rate of fire becomes significantly more reliable. Now, in addition, when you are rolling those 2d6 for the number of shots with the Night Spinner, you definitely want to reroll anything worse than a 5, and you may want to reroll a 5. So having a command reroll in your back pocket is important, and Night Spinners therefore end up being a moderate, potentially a moderate CP drain, and you have to not need that reroll elsewhere during your shooting phase. Most of the time it's fine. The average roll on 2d6 is 7. Most of the time, and if you're, again, a lot of the time you're going to target units with enough models in them that you just, you know, you're going to be rolling 12 dice anyway. And when you're rolling 12 dice, the bonus from the autark and expert crafters, all the ones in 1-2, is pretty powerful. So I think that that's unless you're using the Baal-Tan build that I'm going to talk about in a minute, I think that that's the best sort of core engine for the Night Spinner. And then if you want to enhance it even more, and I think you probably should, also having a Farseer back there is a huge advantage, because the Farseer, and this is a backline Farseer, so this Farseer, because it's staying out of sight in your backfield, is not a model that's going to have Doom. It's probably going to have maybe Fortune and Guide, right? So Fortune, it gives you your 5 up, feel no pain, and Guide could allow some other unit to reroll its hit dice. You don't have to cast Guide on the Night Spinners because you have this other way of buffing their to hit ability. If the autark's there, you definitely don't need Guide. And I prefer to have the autark than just Guide, because Guide only affects one of the Night Spinners. So having both of them be able to reroll all of their ones in 1-2 with crafters is better than having just, when they're hitting on 3s, is better than having them just one of them reroll all of its hit rolls. And you don't, and because in the psychic phase you don't know which one is going to roll higher on the 2d6, then you're also gambling if you're just casting Guide on 1. So if you're thinking to yourself, maybe I don't need the autark, I think you need the autark, unless you're using the Baal-Tan build that I'll talk about soon. But the Farseer has access to a stratagem called Runes of Witnessing, which lets nearby units reroll ones to wound. So you probably see where this is going, right? Runes of Witnessing is 2 CP, which is a lot, and you're not going to need this against all targets, but or in all cases. But having the autark and the Farseer back there next to your 2 Night Spinners, right? If you pop Runes of Witnessing, now you're firing 46 shots. You're hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s, and 1-2 with each tank. You're wounding most things on 3s, most infantry on 3s, in some cases 2s, light infantry on 2s, rerolling 1s, and 1-2. Suddenly these tanks are rerolling pretty much all their dice to hit and most of their dice to wound. Now, remember that when you on 6s to wound, the Night Spinner has -4 AP. So against units like, say, Space Marines with that 3-up power armor, and you might be thinking that, you know, they would be robust against Night Spinners because they're shrugging off 2/3 of the shots. Well, 2 advantages. 1, the flat 2 damage means that every failed save is a dead Marine. And 2, if you're re-rolling a bunch of wound rolls, so if you say one of your Night Spinners is generating 7 shots against some Marines, and it re-rolls basically all its hit dice and ends up hitting like 6 times. And initially, you roll to wound, and you only wound a couple of Marines. You then re-roll a couple of dice again, right? You're re-rolling all of your 1s and some of your 2s, and one of your 2s. So you're re-rolling almost, maybe all of your misses, certainly almost all of your misses. and that reroll increases the likelihood that you are going to get 6s to wound. So you're probably going to have a couple of shots at -4 AP, which just goes straight through and straight up kills the Marine. And then you'll have some where they get to save, but they will also fail some saves. And you have 2 of these tanks doing this, right? So and generally the kinds of Marines are going to target something like Eradicator. They're pretty expensive, so each failed save that is a blow to your opponent for sure. That's powerful. That is a powerful combo. In addition, there is a way to make your Night Spinners effective against other types of unit, or even more effective against things like heavy infantry. Also, by the way, not Marine. For the most part, I love Night Spinners. I play against a lot of AdMech, and they're really good at eliminating those 2-wound AdMech horse dogs that can create all kinds of problems for you first turn. They're effective against Drukhari in later turns of the game when Drukhari, even though most of them only have 1 wound, they have that 5-up feel no pain. Well, when you're doing flat 2 damage, suddenly that 5-up feel no pain doesn't work that well, because they need to roll 5-up on both of their dice to survive the hit. And there are a lot of units against Thousand Suns, right? Thousand Suns get +1 to their armor save against things that do only 1 damage, and so it's very effective against Thousand Suns. There are many matchups in which the Night Spinner is an excellent answer to some of your opponent's most essential infantry units. But there's also a way that you can make the Night Spinner effective against light tanks, even fairly heavy tanks, and that is with Doom. So the Night Spinner has wonderful synergy, and when run in the right kind of list, is a high skill cap unit when it's run alongside a Farseer Skyrunner that is a frontline Farseer. So if you like running 2 Farseers, if you like having the backline Farseer who's using Fortune and Guide, and then the frontline Farseer who's using Executioner and Doom, this is a great build for you. If you have a frontline Farseer who's maybe zipping around with a unit of Shining Spears, or maybe hanging out behind your Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes, maybe with a Warlock Skyrunner and they're using Seer Council or whatever, the Farseer can cast Doom on a unit that it can't see, right? At a pretty good range. And so the combo is you cast Doom on the unit that the Night Spinner needs to take out, which maybe is toughness 8, right? It's the Night Spinner's only strength 7. And an interesting thing happens. So let's say you do want to target some T8 tank or something. Now, to be fair, this is not there's certainly better weapons for this, but the Night Spinner, if you've made room for the Night Spinner in your list by getting rid of something like, I don't know, Warwalkers with Bright Lances or something, there's a way to make the Night Spinner do the same job that those Warwalkers could have done, and it can do that job on a unit that it can't even see, which is pretty cool. So you cast Doom on the target, and now you don't need the Runes of Witnessing Farseer. Potentially, you could even do this in a 1 Farseer list, except you may be using Doom certain turns on things that the Night Spinner is not targeting, and so you don't... It's a choice. You don't need both Farseers. But if you have the frontline Farseer on the bike, it opens up new ways for you to use the Night Spinner, because if you cast Doom on a T8 target, and then you target it with the Night Spinner, and so you're rerolling all of your ones for the Autarch and 1/2 for Expert Crafters, and then you're rerolling all of the dice to wound. Now, against a T8 target, you're only wounding it on a 5-up, but you're rerolling all of your failed wounds, and as a result, you're getting slightly more wounds than you would have gotten if you had a Strength 8 weapon. So if I wound you on a 5-up, but then I reroll all of my failed wounds, the math is a little bit better than if I had just wounded you on a 4-up. And 50% of those wounds are coming in at -4 AP, because if I'm only wounding you on a 5 or a 6, then presumably about half of those are going to be 6s, and so half of those flat 2 damage wounds are coming in with -4 AP, and that goes in most tanks, right? Save on a 3-up. So if it doesn't have an invuln, it's just going straight through the armor, and so if you get through 3 hits or something with one of those Night Spinners, that's 6 damage, and that's better than you could have hoped from 2 Bright Lances on a Warwalker. or certainly about comparable. I think it slightly has the edge statistically. So there are ways that the Night Spinner can be effective against harder targets. It has greater target variety than it initially appears to have. One of my favorite non-infantry targets for the Night Spinner, though, is not T8 tanks. That's kind of that's a party trick to use your Night Spinner against a T8 tank. What I particularly like destroying, you know, those super annoying Drakari light transports that can hold 6 Drakari and they're open topped, and then the incubi or the witches or whatever jump out, and the succubus, and they make trouble for you, and they fly into the midfield and stay out of line of sight behind some midfield piece of terrain, and then the infantry jumps out and charges something and annihilates it. Those guys, the ones that we all hate, well, a single Night Spinner, if you buff it in one of the ways I have described, including with the backline Autarch and the backline Farseer, can stand a pretty good chance of popping one of those light transports. Any sort of a light transport with 5 or 6 wounds, that's great, because that's 3. You just need to get 3 shots through, right? And if you're re-rolling failed wounds, again, it's the math that I was just talking about before. Half of those are coming in with pretty good AP. You can blow away those mid-sized tanks that are hiding, or they're not tanks, mid-sized vehicles that are hiding out of line of sight, and then the second Night Spinner can open up on what was inside and wipe it. Now, it's nice if you have one other indirect fire thing in your list to just help guarantee that this works. You know, maybe there's a single Shadow Weaver, or maybe you have it's too many points for me to even be saying it, but the D cannon on a Wraith Lord, maybe if you have another detachment is running around in the midfield, that could be helpful. Or even just something that could nip in and finish them off, like you've moved some Shining Spears into position or something with their shuriken catapults. But the ability to eliminate fast transports that like to hide out of line of sight in the midfield, or groups of aggressive bikers that want to hide out of line of sight and then jump something, super good. And bikes, again, an ideal target for the Night Spinner, because the 2 wounds on the bike, most bikes, some bikes have 3, but the ones that have 2, every failed save is a dead bike. Okay, so that's a really good build for the Night Spinner. The other really good build for the Night Spinner, if you happen to be a Beltan player, lucky you. Night Spinners are especially good for Beltan players because they can pull this pretty cool trick. You don't need the Autarch at all. You just got 80 points back, because you take a backline Farseer and you give it guide, and then you make it your Warlord, and you take the Beltan Warlord trait that is guide, but it just succeeds automatically for a unit within 6 inches. And so you cast guide on one Night Spinner, and then you use your spooky Beltan, I point at you and you shoot better power on the other Night Spinner, and both tanks get to reroll all of their wounds, and that same Farseer pops Runes of Witnessing, and you get your reroll of 1. Yeah, you don't get to reroll 1/2 for Expert Crafters, because if you're a Beltan player, you don't have Expert Crafters. But even still, it's pretty good. It's definitely a really good build for Beltan. All right. Reasons that I prefer the Night Spinner in many lists to those other options that I talked about, the Shadow Weaver and the Dark Reaper Tempest Launcher. It just has to do with target variety. And don't get me wrong, Shadow Weavers are good. They're only 50 points, and you can have up to 3 of them in a squad. So if you want 2d6 indirect fire shots, you could get that for 100 points instead of 135 points. And if you go to 150 points, it's only 15 points more. Now you have 3d6 shots, but they're strength 6, not strength 7. So, and against a lot of targets, against a toughness 4 target, that doesn't matter. More importantly, they have 1 damage. They're a flat 1 damage unit, and that just completely changes the range of targets available. You just can't. Multi-wound infantry will soak up Shadow Weaver fire pretty effectively. It's just not that scary when the number of casualties is cut completely in half, especially trying to eliminate relatively inexpensive multi-wound units. There are going to be certain lists against which, or certain types of unit against which the Shadow Weaver is better, right? Against Gaunts, for example. Like currently, Devil Gaunts, suddenly with the new Tyranids book, Gaunts with the Devourer infantry weapon, for reasons, are suddenly really good again. And so against, a unit of 30 Gaunts, because they're toughness 3, both the Shadow Weaver and the Doom Weaver will wound them on 2s. In theory, the Doom Weaver on the Night Spinner has a slight advantage because Leviathan, High Fleet Leviathan, which is the one that people are using at the moment, has a 6-up feel no pain. So I guess every now and then, right, your Shadow Weaver will kill a Gaunt that your Doom Weaver would not have. I'm sorry, your Doom Weaver will kill a Gaunt that your Shadow Weaver would not have. But in general, against T3 targets that have basically no armor anyway, that come in big hordes, Shadow Weavers are slightly, trivially more efficient. But you're giving up the ability to target heavy infantry, bikes, to have tricks that let you target tanks, to be able to eliminate midfield fast transports. There's just a lot that your Night Spinner can do that your Shadow Weaver cannot do. Here's the other thing that your Night Spinner can do that your Shadow Weaver cannot do, and that's run away. So if you are using the build that I talked about before with the Autarch and the Farseer and the 2 Night Spinners, or the Beltan, well, let's just stick with the one I was talking about. Make the Farseer your Warlord and give him Falchu's Wing, which is the swooping hawk wings that a character can wear, and take the Autarch with the wings. Because now your whole apparatus of tanks and HQ units, if an enemy either deep strikes into your backfield or manages to break through your line and is threatening these sort of this out of line of sight target elimination powerhouse, you can just move the whole thing about 16 inches, right? Night Spinners have a 16-inch move, and those characters can just make an advance move with their wings. They now have a 12-inch move. They can run away. The Shadow Weavers can't, right? They're surprisingly nippy for support platforms with a 6-inch move, but they're not going to outrun something. And your Night Spinners can reposition. Also, in the late game, your Night Spinners can suddenly zip out and help you score engage on all fronts once. If you're scoring it maybe first turn with your bikes and second turn with some warp spiders and ranger, but maybe turn 4 or 5, it's a little harder to score engage on all fronts. Night Spinners in the late game potentially can help you do that. Hopefully you won't need them to, but it is an option. Dark Reapers. The Dark Reaper Tempest Launcher is really popular right now, partially because trios of Dark Reapers with Rapid Shot and Expert Crafters are so efficient, and so you can, instead of using Rapid Shot, so people are thinking about Reapers anyway and putting them into their lists. And then one option, of course, is to use, instead of the regular Reaper launcher on the Exarch, you take the Tempest launcher and you give them the Exarch power that allows them to automatically reroll the number of hits. And this is one way in which the Tempest launcher has something on the Shadow Weaver. 3 Dark Reapers with a Tempest launcher are around 100 points. They're a little cheaper than a Doom Weaver, and that Tempest launcher does fire 2d6 shots, which is the same as the Night Spinner. And the ability to reroll the number of shots without spending a CP is nothing to sneer at. Again, if you're targeting units with more than 10 models, the blast keyword will prevent you from having to do that anyway. But that's pretty great. And unlike the Doom Weaver, the Tempest Launcher has -2 AP on everything. Again, fabulous. And against light infantry, it's more effective. But it's only strength 4, and it has a damage profile of 1. And so, again, there are matchups in which the Tempest Launcher, against a very particular type of infantry, something like Gaunts, the Doom Weaver on the Night Spinner will wound those Gaunts on a 2, while the Tempest Launcher will only be doing it on a 3. But it probably balances out with the -2 AP, and so the Reapers become a little bit more efficient target elimination against light infantry, and you have the other two Reapers with the Reaper launchers, which are pretty good against the sorts of heavy infantry that Night Spinners are good against. In fact, they're even better against it. But there are two trade-offs with the Reapers. One, they're super fragile. There are 3 models in that squad, and each of them has a single wound and a 3-up save. And yes, you can fire and fade one squad of Reapers, but what do you do with your other squad of Reapers? And what if your opponent has something with indirect fire? Or what if your opponent has a flyer that can just nip into your backfield? And Reapers are so squishy and so easy to eliminate. People are so scared of them that there's a big impetus to do so. Now you can currently fire and fade a Reaper into a transport, but once if you have 3 squads of Dark Reapers that can all fire and fade into, or well, I guess only one of them could fire and fade because it's a stratagem. To fire and fading one of your squads of Dark Reapers into a Falcon or something, while your other Dark Reapers are your other Dark Reapers can be killed, and the one that you're fire and fading, you just had to pay another 130-ish points, depending on what you're doing, for the transport, in order for them to have a chassis to jump into. You could have literally bought a Night Spinner for that. So it's just Reapers are good, and Shadow Weavers have some play too, but Reapers are fragile. They can't run away. And there's also this weird tension between the Tempest Launcher, which wants to target things out of line of sight, and the other 2 weapons in the squad, which can only target things that they can see. And so in many ways, I think that the Night Spinners, the dual Night Spinners can be a safer pick. I really think that when you're going Reapers, you are better off doing the rapid shot thing where you just double down on the Exarch having the regular Reaper launcher, and they play a very specific role, and it's not light infantry elimination. I think that Reapers do better when they specialize a little bit more. They're good against tanks. They can be good against heavy infantry, but I think the math, as a generalist unit, I think the math favors the Night Spinner, and that's just my opinion. Recently there was a Craftworld's list that did pretty well in a GT that had 3 units of Reapers with Tempest launchers. It's obviously a strong pick, but I do think that there are good reasons to consider the Night Spinners instead. Okay, that pretty much brings us to the end. I'll just say that in deployment, it makes a lot of sense to deploy your Night. You want to put your Night Spinners completely out of line of sight, and the only reason to deploy them late is to look at the sorts of things that your opponent might be able to answer them with. It's very unlikely that your opponent will be able to hide from the Night Spinners, so where you put them on the table probably isn't going to have a huge influence on where your opponent puts her models, because 48 inches is 48 inches, and 9th edition 40K, that's pretty much the whole table. So you don't really have to think a great deal about which units you want to target. A little bit, if it's one extreme side of the table, if you can keep them sort of in the center of the board, out of line of sight, that's great, because then they really are covering pretty much everything. But you're not really deploying them with an eye towards targets, but you are deploying them with an eye towards threats. So if your opponent has some kind of super fast flyer that can nip into your backfield and it has anti-tank weapons on it, or your opponent has something like a Swarm Lord that will let it double move something into your deployment, like Gene Stealers, or something like a Chaos faction with Warp Time, or Harlequin Bikes. I don't know. If your opponent has something quick that can nip in there and threaten them, that is the thing you need to consider, either by putting them out of range of that, or screening them if it's against something that doesn't have fly. And then you'll obviously have to think about deep strikers in your backfield on turn 2. But in general, deploying them is pretty straightforward. Using them is pretty straightforward until you start messing around with introducing target variety by utilizing the Farseer on the jet bike using Doom. Then it becomes a higher skill cap unit that's more sensitive, that will perform much better for a very skilled player. But I think initially you can do really well with the Night Spinner build that I've discussed here without necessarily being a veteran player. And if you're doing that, I think last thing, and then I'll stop ranting. But I think that you're better off focusing on your opponent's objective holders with the Night Spinners. Like that's the game is most of the game is the objective play. I mean, that is the game. The game is the objective play. So if your opponent has something super dangerous like a unit of Eradicators, by all means pop them on turn 1. But otherwise, you don't have to focus on threat elimination with the Night Spinners. If you have an opportunity to prevent your opponent from scoring 5 points, or even better, prevent your opponent from scoring 5 points, and as a result cause yourself to score 5 more, that's a way better move. Unless it's an incredibly dangerous unit that you're eliminating, like you're popping a transport with, I don't know, Drazar and 5 Incubi in it. Like, barring something like that, use them for objective play. That's how you win games. So that's it. That's the last unit focus video on a Codex unit. I love the Night Spinner. I think it's really powerful in the current meta, which at the moment favors, we're back to favoring infantry again, and to some degree bikes, because there's so much really good anti-tank in the game. And so against a lot of the types of lists that are performing well right now, this will do well. And they can even, by the way, do some real damage to those irritating orc vehicles that are all over the place, because those things tend to be a little bit fragile, although they're cheap, which is annoying. That's why they're so good. Okay, that's it. I will be back soon with a not unit focus video. And if you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you have your own ideas about how to use Night Spinners effectively on the table, I hope that you will leave comments to that effect in the space below. And if you are interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, I hope you'll follow the link and consider doing that. Okay, guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much. Looking forward to talking to all of you again soon. Take care.